Okay, Zok the Heilige Gemara. So every time we start, I notice people don't know who's here. So Dave, Shmuel Lerman, and Duvi Menzelevsky are here.
Oh,
He's here. So like at least you know who you're talking to. You want to know who's here and who's not. Okay,
okay.
Zok the Heilige Gemara. Amalei Ravina Leravashi. So let's just refresh our memories as to what we were discussing. We were discussing the machloikis between, on one side, Rav, who was Machmir, and on the other side, Shmuel and Eruvin, who were Mekel. What was the discussion about? Rab Shimon had a huge kula. Rab Shimon said that even if no Eruvin were made, no shitu from avuyos, no Eruvin chatzeres, any kalim that were left in a chatzar, and they were in a chatzar when Shabbos arrived, you're allowed to move them from chatzar to chatzar. No problem. You can move them around. You can move them to the mavoi. The whole problem, the whole prohibition, the whole requirement to make Erev Chatzeres is only so that you could take things from your home out into the Chatzar, into the Mavi. But once something's already in the Chatzar and the Mavi, you don't need Erev Chatzeres at all. Now, there was a question about when Rabbi Shimon said this. Rav said that this kula was restricted to a case where no individual Chatzar in this group made Erev Chatzeres. And because of that, there's no possibility, or very limited possibility, for there to be any kalim that started Shabbos in someone's house to be found in the chutzner. And therefore, we're not concerned, because all the kalim around were probably in the chutzner when Shabbos arrived, so there's no problem bringing it back and forth from chutzner to chutzner. However, if one of these groups happened to have made an internal erev, now there's already a possibility that someone took a keli from his own home out into the chutzner. Now we're afraid that if we allow kalim to go back and forth from chutzner to chutzner, that keli that was originally in the house might also go from chutzner to chutzner, and there Rab Shimon prohibited. So the machloikas is everybody agrees that a keli that was in the house before Shabbos cannot go from chutzner to chutzner. The question is, should we throw out the baby with the bathwater? Should we outlaw any kelim going from chutzner to chutzner, because we might confuse it with that one keli that did come from a house on Shabbos? That was the machlokas. Amalei Ravina Ravashi. Ravina asked Ravashi, "Mi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi? Did Rabbi Yochanan actually say that you're not geyser? You don't have to worry. And even though one of the chatzeres made an erev, and there's a possibility that there'll be kalim that started off in a house in the chatzer, he's still going to allow people to take kalim from chatzer to chatzer, even though there's no erev between the chatzeres." The Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan made a general proclamation that whenever there's a stam mishnah, that's a signal, since Rebbe didn't quote who said it, it's a signal that Rebbe holds that this is the halacha. Utnan, and we learned a stam mishnah. Again, we know this mishnah because we've learned it already. Kaisel shebein shtei chatzeres. A kaisel that's in between two chatzeres. You have a wall that's in between two chatzeres. Gavoya asara, the wall is 10 tefachim high, which is what a wall needs to be. But it also has a surface area on top of it that would give it the status of its own independent chatzer. Because anytime you have a reshus that's arba, it gets its independence. So the halacha is ma'arvin shnayim. Since there's a wall in between these two chatzeres with no access in between them, they each have to make their own independent erev. Ve'ein ma'arvin echad. These two chatzeres cannot make an erev with each other so that they can pass kalim from one chatzar to the next. Hayu b'roishay peiros. What if there were peiros on top of the wall and people wanted to access those peiros? So elu oilin mikan ve'oichlin. The people from chatzar A can climb up to the wall and eat the peiros. Ve'elu oichlin mikan ve'oichlin. And the people in chatzar B can climb up the wall and eat peiros. Ubilvad shelo yoyridu lamata. They're not allowed to take any peiros down. So this is clearly saying peiros which were in the chutzner, meaning on top of the wall, even before Shabbos started, according to Reb Shimon, such peiros you should be able to move from chutzner to chutzner. Yet, the Mishnah here is prohibiting it. Why should it be usher? Now, I have a way to explain why it should be usher. If one of the two chatzeres happened to have made an erev, now it prohibits everybody from carrying from chutzner to chutzner. If you hold like Rav's chomer, right? According to Rav, you have a way out.
If that's the case, no different kind of specific case of carrots on top of the wall. It can be anywhere.
Well, we're just trying to say that you're not allowed to move pairs from chutzner to chutzner, right? So this was the example. So in a case, here's a case where someone might want to move pairs from chutzner to chutzner. You're not allowed to. How could you possibly explain why you can't allow? The only way you can explain it is if you hold like Rav, then since one of the Chatzeris might have made an Erev, that would prohibit anything from moving. Zok Gemara, no, my lamata lebottom. There was no Erev and any Chatzeris, and you don't make any type of Xeris, and everything was mutter. So what's the problem with taking the pairs down? Nothing. Of course you're allowed to take the pairs down from one Chotzer to the next. What you're not allowed to do is take these pairs into one of the houses. So it's interesting because if you look at the Lashon Mishnah, all it says is uvavat shelo yeridu lamata. Pashut pshat lamata means just down into the chotzer. We're reading into it and saying it means what you're not allowed to do is take it into one of the houses, but into the chotzer itself you'd be allowed to. Right? You would be allowed. No, not into a house. Never into a house. Only hektish from chotzer to chotzer. Into a bais you're never allowed without a. I'm sorry. That's pashut. You can't take it into the house. That's a very good kasha. I don't know. It's a very good kasha. And the Gemara asks even stronger. Vatani Reb Chia, okay, you quoted me a mission from Rebbe, but Reb Chia brought a brisa down that's even more explicit. And it says, that's pretty explicit. I'm not allowed to stand on the side of the wall and eat my pears on my side of the wall. Why shouldn't that be allowed? Omer Lei. So who's talking to who? If you look back, it was Ravina or Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi responded back to Ravina, I don't understand what you're saying. V'chi Rebbe lo yishana. Where Reb Chia didn't make things up. Reb Chia only quoted things that he heard from Rebbe. Once we're arguing, once we're taking the position that Rebbe never said that, and it means lamata b'bodim, the Reb Chia minayin lo. Reb Chia can't on his own make up this halacha that it would be usher to take it down. So Reb Chia must also mean means don't take it into your home. So Duvi has a very good kasha. It's very shvelach to say that. That's not the pashtus. And that's A. And B is, and even if that is pshat, what's the chiddush? Why do I need a mishnah to tell me that when there was no erev v'chetzeres done, that I'm not allowed to take something from the chotzer into my house? Right? That's what Duvi is asking. It's a very good kasha. I don't know. It's an excellent kasha. What would be the chiddush? We already heard so many times that without an erev v'chetzeres, you're not allowed to take peiros from the chotzer to the bayis. So I don't know the answer. It's an excellent kasha. I don't know. I do not know. Let me think for a second. What could the possible chiddush be? The only possible chiddush that could be is that maybe the top of the wall should be considered a makom p'tur. But why should you say that either? If it's 4x4, we already know the rules of makom p'tur. So I don't know. I think it's better to blind with a good kasha than to blind with a crumb of our kvetch the teretz. Right? My Rashiva once told me, he asked a kasha in shir, and I offered a solution for it. He tells me, Yosy Zalman, was darf die kwetschen? Was darf die sagen krumm, so glatt? Memele mich, ich muss sagen, als jeden Tag. Hab nicht kein Breirach. Also gut, kann ich sagen gut, und nicht einfach sagen krumm, aber ich darf sagen. Du darfst doch nicht sagen, Kanzil. So, ob du nicht gut doch nicht. Sagst du mal weiter. Okay, Ravel, you had a good sense of humor. Sagt der Gemara weiter. Itmar, stei chatzeres, v'churva afras b'neim. What if you had two chatzeres, and there was a churva in between the two chatzeres? Interesting case. And Rashi tells us, it doesn't matter if this churva was jointly owned between the neighbor on either side of that churva, or if it belonged to a third party. It doesn't matter. Right? Reb Shimon holds you can carry from chotzer to chotzer. It doesn't make a difference. If it's your chotzer, if somebody else's chotzer, there's no problem. But what is important is these chorva cannot have been open to Rishus Rabbim because then for sure it's also. But we're talking about an enclosed chorva that's a Rishus HaYachid. It's in between two other chatzeres, and according to Reb Shimon, normally you can carry back and forth. So we have an interesting case up here. Achas irva, v'achas lo irva. One chotzer. So let's say it's chotzer A, and we'll call the chorva B, and the next chotzer is chotzer C. So chotzer A made an erev amongst themselves, which means that there's a possibility that there'll be kalim from the homes in chotzer A lying around in chotzer A. Achas irva, v'achas lo irva. Amar Rav Huna said, now based on the rule where whenever you have a rishus that's between two rishuyos and there's no erev in between the two chatzeres, we normally allot it to jurisdiction that has easier access to it, right? That was an old concept that we learned. So Amar Rav Huna, what we will do is we will say that this chorva is connected to the chutzner that did not make the Eruv. So in our example, that's chutzner C. Why? Because there is no restriction. There's no restriction because all of the kalim found in the chutzner would surely have been there before Shabbos because there's no way it could have gotten there on Shabbos. But chutzner A, who made an internal Eruv, and there might be kalim from houses lying around in the chutzner on Shabbos because people could have lawfully removed them from the houses. Because we're afraid that there's kalim lying around in the chutzner that might have originated this Shabbos in homes, and you're not allowed to take those to the churva according to Rav's version. According to Rav's version of Rav Shimon. V'chi by Rav Amar, Chi the son of Rav. So we have Rav Huna saying over in the name of Rav, a Talmud, and then you have Rav's son coming along and saying, V'chi by Rav Amar, Af l'she'irva. My father, I remember my father said, l'she'irva. That means even the chutzner that made an Eruv, and even in the chutzner where there's a possibility that there's kalim there, they're also allowed to share in the use of the Eruv. And therefore, ushtei masuros. Now that there's a possibility that the chorva could be contaminated, so to speak, with kalim that were in a house, nobody's allowed to use this chorva anymore because we're afraid that kalim that started off in the house might be being passed back and forth from chutzner to chutzner, and that everybody holds as us. Frekt, Reb Chia, you might argue on me. If you want to argue and you want to tell me that both sides should be mutter, if that's how you want to argue this, if you want to argue with me and say that my father's words were that both sides should be able to legally access the chorva, then I pose a question to you. My father, Rav, said that if one of the two chatzeros made an Eruv, when there's no chorva in between them, they're just two chatzeros that are side by side. My father said that if there's one of the two chatzeros made an Eruv, you can no longer carry from one to the other. So I'll ask you a question. If you're going to say that with a chorv in between, they could both share it, then why did my father outlaw two chatzeros that are side by side? If one chatzer made an Eruv, why can't you take kalim from the chatzer that didn't make an Eruv, where you know for sure that they were in the chutzner before Shabbos, because it's chutzner l'irva? Why can't they bring their kalim over into the other chutzner? My father doesn't allow it. So the same way he doesn't allow that, he wouldn't allow us to share in the churban. Zok the Gemara, very, very nice shot to know what you're saying from your father, but I think you're not drawing a good conclusion. Because Hassam, when you have two chatzeros side by side, and there's no churva involved, even the minteri money, the bottom of chutzner, it's very safe to store your kalim from your house in the chutzner. You're not worried that someone's going to break in. You're not worried that there's not a secure perimeter. So it's common. It's very common that people will leave or will take kalim from their home and place them into the chutzner. Therefore, asalafuki. That's where we're going, sir. And we're showing my masber that the Rabbanan don't make a gzera on a thing that's not shchiach, only a thing that's shchiach. So Rav held that once there's an Eruv in the chutzner, people are going to bring out a lot of kalim. It's going to be very common for bringing out a lot of kalim because they're safe there. People aren't afraid to leave things in their backyard. They're safe there. But hacha b'chorva, could you imagine? You would store your bicycle in your backyard. But would you ever store your bicycle if there's a house being built next door to you? Would you ever leave your bicycle on the construction site? Not a chance in the world, because you think someone's going to come and take it. So hacha b'chorva, here we're talking about a chorva. Even the loy minteri mani de chatzor b'chorva, since it's not likely, it's not safe to store your goods in the chorva, it's very unlikely that someone is going to take something from his house and store it in the chorva that we have to worry that it might end up in the next chatzor. That's not going to happen. So since it's such an uncommon thing, there's good reason to say that the takana of Rav should not apply to this case with the chorva. Ikadamri, there was another approach to how this whole thing went down, that Reb Chia took the opposite position. My father said that both sides have access to this chorva, and they both can put their kalim into this chorva. If you want to argue that they should both be usher, why? Because of what my father said about two neighboring chatzeres. Since he didn't allow you to take kelim from a chatzer that there was no eruvin to a chatzer that there wasn't eruvin. Hasam, even the minteri money the bottom b'chatzer. There, why did he aser? Because it's safe to keep kalim from the house in the chutzner, the exact same svara, but being used in the opposite direction. Therefore, it's going to be common that there'll be a lot of kalim that started off in the home in the chutzner, and we have to be worried that they'll move back and forth from house to house. It's not likely that people are going to put kalim into a churva, and therefore we're not going to make takanas to deal with it. So we have two options in Reb Chia, either in the churva that could share, or in the churva that can't share. It all depends on whether or not you want to say it's similar to two chatzeres that are side by side or not. And the primary reason to make the difference is that people will normally store things in their chatzer because it's safe, and people will normally not store things in a churva because it's not safe. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Constructions that are not safe. When we have equipment on sites, they go missing all the time. It's a normal thing. Zok the Gemara. Gag Godol Samach L'Chad. This is a sugya that we're very familiar with because we learned to halacha if a small chutzner opens up to a big chutzner. So you have a chutzner that's 10 amas by 10 amas, and it opens up into a chutzner that's 20 amas by 20 amas. So if you're standing in the small chutzner looking to the big chutzner, you don't see any wall. The fourth wall, the wall that would separate the two chutzers, you don't see it all. But if you're standing in the big chutzner looking towards the small chutzner, then you do see part of the fourth wall, because since your chutzner is bigger than the smaller chutzner, you see the two areas where your walls close in on the smaller chutzner. So so this would apply by a chutzner. It would also apply by a gag. So gag gadol samach l'chad. You have a large building that's right up against a smaller building. So the halakha is a gadol mutter. We said that you're allowed to carry in the roof that's on top because it's considered walled and severed from the ketana. So let's stop a second. We've just come off Reb Shimon, who said you're allowed to bring things from chutzner to chutzner no matter what, right? So Zokt Rashi, our Mishnah is not talking about things that started off on the roof. Our Mishnah is not talking about kalim that started off in the building or started off in the bayis. For there, you do need to have either an Eruvin chatzeres to be able to transfer from one chutzner to the next, or you need the wall to be severed. You need it to be a wall in between, so that there's no problem with one chutzner answering the other. So here you had a gadol samach, and there was no eruv made, and you wanted to carry a keli from inside the big building up onto the roof of the big building, and then you want to walk into the small building. So the halach is, you're for sure not allowed to do that. But the question is, can you carry within the big building itself? Can you carry within the small building itself? So within the big building itself, hagadol mutter, you can carry. You know why? Because we look at it like there's a wall there. There's a fourth wall, because on either side of the gap, there's there's a wall, because if this chutzner is 20 and the chutzner that opens up to it is 10, so then you have an extra 10 amas. So you have 5 amas on one side, 5 amas on the other side. So you have some wall there. The opening, of course, cannot be more than 10 amas, we learned, because if an opening is more than 10 amas, it no longer qualifies as a door. It's a breach. So of course, this case has to be speaking where the opening was 10 amas or less. So the gadol is mutter because the gadol is considered to be walled off from the small one, and therefore there's no eruv reshuyos here. But avakot nasser, people who carry up on top, if they take their kelim from the small building to the roof, they're not allowed to walk around the roof with their cotton, because that is considered open to the other side. So it's very interesting. Such a doorway is a one-way doorway. It's considered a doorway for one side, but it's considered a breach for the other side. Depends on your perspective. Like it's considered a perfectly fair election from one perspective, and it's total fraud from another perspective. So we understand that depending on your viewpoint, there would be a huge difference in how you view a certain thing. Zok Gemara weiter. Same thing with Chotzer Gedoyla, Shenifra Shalaktana. It's the identical case. Gedoyla Muteres, Uktana Asura, Mepneshi Kepischa Shal Gedoyla. This is a very important line that the Gemara is going to elaborate on. It's because we look at it like the small Chotzer is the doorway of the big Chotzer, because that wall acts as a doorway. Masha'enkein, the Gedoyla will never be like the doorway of the big one, of the small one. To the contrary, there's no doorway; it's wide open. Zok the Gemara. Since the mechanics of the gag are identical to the mechanics of the chutzner, why did the Mishnah have to repeat it as two separate cases? Lamali lemisna tarte. So Gemara, whether you hold like Rab or whether you hold like Shmuel, there's a reason why the Tana would have repeated this case twice. L'Rav katani gag dumi the chutzner. The Tana wanted to draw a reference from gag to chutzner to teach us something about gag. Ma chutzner minkra mechitza. Just like by a chutzner that has walls around it, the walls are very easy to see. Af gag, remember, for the gag, we don't really have a roof. We don't really have a fence around the roof. We're using the good asik. We're looking to extend the walls of the perimeter of the building to be considered as virtual walls for the roof area. So Zokt Rav Av Gag Nami Minkra Mechitzta. The only time you say good asik is if you could see the walls from the roof. So if your roof overhangs the walls, so you can't see the walls at all, or the wall in between the big chutzner, the big gag and the little gag, we can't see it, there you would not say good asik. So that's according to Rav, that's what he would extract from the Mishnah, where it creates a comparison from chutzner to gag. Ula Shmuel, who holds you say good achas even if you can't tell. So what is the comparison from gag to chutzner? Ula Shmuel, gag dumi the chutzner. Ma chutzner. What's unique about the chutzner? The wall that separates in between the big chutzner and the little chutzner, the kador shel harabim. Since there's people that walk over it, really, according to Shmuel, you say good asik even though you can't see that wall. So why don't you say good asik over here by the roof? The teretz is because by a chutzner, people are walking back and forth. Since people are walking back and forth, there's no fence in the middle. Av gag nami the kador shel harabim. The reason why I don't allow to carry in the small gag, just like the big gag has a wall around it, the small gag also has a wall around it. Why do you say it's porous? If you say good asik, say that this imaginary wall pops up right in between the two buildings. Why did you say that? I don't say it because people are walking back and forth. And we learned earlier that if it's kadoshi barab, when people walk back and forth, then that fence can't be a fence, not even an imaginary fence, because people are trampling it. So Zok Shmuel, when does our Mishnah say that it's usher to carry in the Ketana, because the Ketana is as if it doesn't have a wall, it's only if people are constantly walking back and forth across this roof. So you can't have an imaginary wall. But if people were not normally walking across the roof, not only would it be allowed to carry in the Gedolah, it would also be allowed to carry in the Ketana, because the virtual wall in between the two buildings, we would say good asik. Correct. It depends on how the roof is used. That's right. Yosef Rabbah, Reb Zera, the Rabbi Bar Chanan, the Yosef Abai Gevayu. So Rabbi Reb Zera and Rabbi Bar Chanan and Abai were sitting around. The Yasvi, what did they do when they sat around? This is the learning. The Yasvi the Kamri, and they said, Shemami Nami Masnisin, from the Mishnah that seems to say that the big chutzner is the dominant one, and the small chutzner is just like its doorway. Shemami Nami Masnisin, that the Yurei Gedoyla Biktana, the Ein the Yurei Ktana Gedoyla. The people who live in the big chutzner, they sort of take over the small chutzner, but the people who are in the small chutzner, they don't take over the big chutzner. So this is a nice slogan, but how does it impact us halacha l'maisa? Ketzad. Gefanim bigdal. Now we know the halacha is you're not allowed to klaya kerem is planting a vineyard, planting wine seeds together with foreign vegetation. Rashi is going to tell us in number base, it doesn't apply to anything you plant. It's only applied to two types of seeds are going to be klaya kerem dairaisa. Midrabanan, any seeds that you plant near a vine will be a problem. So ketzad, gefanim bigdal. What if you planted in the big chutzner or in the big gag, if it's a green roof? You see, they must have had green roofs in those days too. So gefanim b'gedolah, if they planted gefanim in the big chutzner, also l'zroi sektana. You're not allowed to plant other species in the ketana because the ketana is like part of the gedolah. From the gedolah's perspective, the ketana is sort of bottled to the gedolah. So if you're in the ketana, you're not allowed to plant anything if the gedolah was already planted with vineyards. Oh, beautiful kasha. Rashi says the halacha is if you're 4 amos apart by a vineyard, or even 6 tvachim apart, if it's just an individual plant, you're allowed to. So Rashi, here it's worse. Here, even if you're 4 amos away, if you're in the ketana, it's still a problem Because since we consider the entire Ketana as like the gateway to the Gedolah, that the fact that it's a gateway will make it into a problem, even if it's more than 4 amos away, which is a big chiddush. And the Rishonim discuss.
Even if it's four months away from the border.
Your mamish gavaltic. That's exactly what the Rishonim discuss. The Rishonim discuss that if it's 4 amos away from the border, maybe that wouldn't be usher. That's exactly what the Rishonim discuss. Unbelievable. You're bang on. That maybe if it's right by the door, then it's a problem, even if it's 4 amos away. But if it's 4 amos from the gateway, from the imaginary wall, maybe then it would not be a problem. So, you would not be allowed to plant the smaller field. But v'imzara, and if you did plant and you weren't allowed to, zroy nasurin, those things that you plant become usher because of klaya kerem. Gefanim mutarim, but the gefanim would be mutar because we look at it like the zroyim are infringing on the gefanim, not the gefanim infringing on the zroyim. How about gefanim biktana? What if there were gefanim in the small chutzner? Then mutal is rois hakdoila. Then you're allowed to plant other foreign matters in the gedoila, because again, we're the main. We don't look at it like we're bottled to you. We're not infringing. We're not infringing on the ketana when we're planting in the gedoila. So the gedoila is independent, and therefore you'd be allowed to. So Rashi has a very important kasha here. Now Rashi says, okay, when I plant, maybe there's no isser, but as they start growing together, it should create a problem because they're yearning from each other. And on that, Rashi says that since klaya kerem, if it's not the specific 2 minim that are asur midaraisa, and Rashi says the 2 minim that are asur midaraisa are canvas and luf. I don't know what those species are exactly, but we're not talking about those. Since Israel only with rabbanon, they don't asur if you planted it beheter. When you planted this roya in the gedolah, you were allowed to. So since you were allowed to, when the rabbanon are not going to answer it later. Tosfos holds that doesn't make a difference, and no matter what, if you planted in the gedolah, it should never be a problem, even though there's gefanim in the ketana. Because again, we look at it like you're bottled to us, we're not bottled to you. How about get? The halach is if a woman is in a chutzner and you throw the get into the chutzner and she's there, she's calling it a get, and therefore you're rid of your wife. So what if this woman owned 2 chatzeres, a big one and a small one, exactly this configuration like we discussed, isha v'gdoila, the get bektana, and so the woman's in the big chutzner and the husband threw the get into the small chutzner, miskareshes, she'll be divorced again because we say the ketana is bottled to the big, and therefore if she's in the big chutzner and the get was thrown into the small chutzner, that's bottled to her chutzner. So it's as if the get was thrown into the big chutzner. But what if Isha Biktana, the woman is in the small chutzner, the get Bigdoila, then any miscareshes, because you'll never say that the big chutzner is bottled to the small chutzner. Now we're up to the exciting one. Tzibur Bigdoila. What if you had 10 people in the big chutzner, Ushliach Tzibur Biktana, and the chazan was in the small chutzner. Now the chazan in those days was much more important. People didn't have Siddur, people didn't know how to daven, so the Shliach Tzibur was actually moitzi everybody with their tefillah. But in this case, the Shliach Tzibur is not in the same chutzner. So if the Shliach Tzibur is Bektana, Yoitzin, Yidei Chavasim, because you say that the Ketana is bottled to the big, and we look at it as if the Shliach Tzibur is in the big chutzner. But if Tzibur Bektana, if everybody is in the small chutzner, or Shliach Tzibur Bigdoila, the chazan is the big one, you don't say that the big one is bottled to the small one. And Rashi asks, so why did you say that the small one is bottled to the big one? And you're sort of moving the oilam into the area where the chazan is. And that Rashi says, no, you don't move the oilam to the chazan. You got to move the chazan to the oilam. So therefore, here's where we're talking about a minyan. Tisha B'Gdoila. What if there's 9 people in the big chutzner, the Yochid B'Ktana, and there's only 1 person in the small chutzner, mitzdarfen, because you say the Yochid is swallowed up, and it's as if he's in the Gedoila. But Tisha B'Ktana, B'Chid B'Gdoila, ain't mitzdarfen. So here's where the shaila comes up. So the most important yisoid over here is the Rashba says, all of these halachas of mitzdarfen and mitzdarfen is if the people can't see each other. But if the people can see each other, there's not a problem at all. So based on the Rashba, like again, I don't know if we pass much to Rashba, but based on the Rashba, in any backyard minyan, as long as people can see each other, it's mitzaref. Now that's not halacha l'maisa. That's not halacha l'maisa. Halach al-Maisa, even if there's a Tzuras Pesach in between, it's a problem. I know Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky has been by parlor meetings where there's a dining room and a living room, and there's sort of a Tzuras Pesach in between the two rooms, or sometimes two glass doors that you could open up. And when they were davening Ma'ariv, Rav Shmuel would tell the Chazan to daven right in the threshold so that both sides are going to be part of the minyan. But there's a lot of support in the Poskim that merely seeing is good enough to blend everything together. And then there are those who say that seeing only helps if it's 9 and 1, but if it's 8 and 2, maybe it wouldn't. And then there was another svara about joining Minyanim. In the days of Rabbi Yosy Ber, when Rabbi Yosy Ber was Rosh Yeshiva, they would have a minyan for mincha every day, and it was in a very small room, and there was a lot of overflow crowd in the hallway that joined the minyan. So Rabbi Yosy Ber said that's for sure not a problem. All of these shilas are to make the minyan, but once there's a minyan, as long as you can hear them, no matter where you are, you're considered being mitzaref to the minyan. And this is very negated Lamaisa, because when I was in the mirror in Eretz Yisrael, I was able to hear the chazan perfectly from my bed, because my apartment was in a building just alongside the Beis Medrash, and it was maybe 50 feet away. And with my window open, I was like I was in the Beis Medrash. So I could have davened fully there, and be noted according to this. Huh? That's correct. That's correct. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Soya b'gdoila. Now, of course, if there's a smell, there's no question about it that you can't daven there. But we're talking about there's no smell. But there's soya b'gdoila, also licorice krishma b'ktana, because it's as if you're in the gdoila. But soya b'ktana, mutter licorice krishma b'gdoila, because we don't say that the gdoila is like it's in the ktana. What's that?
Even if you don't smell
Only if you don't smell. If you smell it, then there's a problem regardless. Amulu Abaye, Imkain comes out. Matzinu mechitza le'isser. Based on this, you have a case where a mechitza actually will make an isser. How is that? Shilmola a mechitza. If there was no mechitza between you and the tzoya, then between the geffen and the zera, if it was all in one big chutzner, like Duvi Medzalevsky mentioned, that if everything was all together in one chutzner and you were planting geffen together with zera, marchik dal aramis v'zereya, all you would have to do is be 4 amos away. Now that we have this imaginary barrier, asura makes it worse, because now we say it's like you planted foreign material in the Pesach, and that's also even more than 4 amos away. How could you possibly say that mechitza should make it worse? It's a barrier. How could a barrier make it worse? A barrier should only be able to make it better. Are you so shocked? Would you never find a mechitza that causes iser? But none we learned. If a big chutzner opened up into a small chutzner, gedoyla muteres uketana asura mipnei sheika pescha shel gedoyla, which is the case of our Mishnah. However, but if you extended the walls of the small chutzner straight into the big chutzner, so now both chutzeres are the same size, like you see in this picture here. But let's look at the Arshko picture, because it's 3-dimensional. It's nicer. So if these walls were not here, this wall here and this wall, if they were not here, then it would be a small chutzner opening up into a big chutzner. If I added these 2 walls, now it's for sure all one big chutzner, and therefore they would answer on each other, and it would be usher to carry on both sides. So you see, the fact that you added a wall makes it worse. So to Gemara, that's not called adding a wall. The problem is not because I added a wall. The problem is because by putting those 2 walls in, I'm shunting out of the circuit the 2 outer walls. So it's not true that I'm adding a wall that's causing a problem. About the mechitza is a good thing, can't cause a problem. But when you're making this mechitza, you're shunting out the other walls. So now it's like one big chutzner. So that's not a raya. You're making such a big commotion that there's no such thing as mechitza leisur. I'm going to show you an example of where a mechitza could cause a problem. Because by Itmar, we learned regarding the mitzvah of sukkah. So Rashi says you had 2 walls. You have a sukkah with 2 parallel walls, but the other 2 walls are not there. But what you did is for the 3rd and 4th wall, you put a post the size of a tefach. We know for a sukkah you need two walls, and the third wall only has to be a tefach. So what happens if exactly that happened? I had two parallel walls, and I put one post in the opening on either end, which would be the wall of a tefach. So the halacha is ksheira. That sukkah is kosher. But the ilu hishra pitzimeo. But what if I built out the wall so that it should include where it's sticking out because of the post? Then psula. That would passel the sukkah, because now I no longer have the tefach wall on either end. So you see over here that adding a wall could be a problem. Amalei Abaye, it doesn't make any sense what you're saying. L'didik sheira. According to me, it would actually be kosher. It would actually be kosher. And Rashi says that peligi Allah b'hamil l'kamam b'pirkin. I argue because I hold afilu ein shum mechitza. Even if there was no wall at all, even without those tefach on either side, I hold you say pitikra yorid v'soisim. You look at it as if the ceiling comes down to the bottom, and there's a ceiling there because the stam achsadra, a typical achsadra, is built where you have four posts, and then you have horizontal posts running across from post to post. So since I have a horizontal post on either end, I could look at it like there's a virtual wall coming down. So according to me, actually it wouldn't be possible in the Hishra Pitzimel, because I have walls because of Pitikra Yored Besoisim. And with the Dach, according to you, that you don't say Pitikra Yored Besoisim, you know why it doesn't work there? Not because you made more walls, again, because by making the wall thicker, you're actually eliminating the other two walls. Because we originally put a post that will stick out a tefach into the airspace. When you built it out, now you just have a thicker wall. So you've eliminated that. So again, it's not pshat mechitza is causing a problem. You're shunting out the original walls. That's why there's a problem. Okay, up until this point I prepared, and from here on, I'll ask everyone to help me over here. Today's daf is Tzaddik Aleph. Yeah, so we're doing okay time-wise. Amalei, Rabbi Bar Chanan Labaye. Rabbi Bar Chanan challenged Abaye. V'loy matzina mechitza l'isser. Again, are you a buyer so shocked that you could never have a mechitza l'isser? You never find the mechitza l'isser? Well, Tanya, we learned bayis shechetche mikura. You had a house that half of it had a ceiling on it, and Rashi says chetche mikura mechusa begag chalak. It's covered with a flat roof. Kein tikra shaliyah. Just like the just like the floor of an attic. In other words, it would be flat. And half of it did not have a ceiling. So the halach is kufanim kan. If there's vines, Rashi Takasakiri, if you've planted vines under the area that has a ceiling, mutal izraya kan. You're allowed to plant, so Rashi chutz l'kiramiyat. So you could have a wine vine planted right up against the imaginary wall of the Pitikra, and right outside you could plant zera. You can plant any other type of plant. And you don't have to create a separation in between the two plants. Why? The Pitikra yored v'soisim. We say that there's an imaginary wall, the end of the covered area. We say it's as if there's a wall that goes straight down to the bottom. And it's as if there is a wall in between them. Oh, so the archville has a good picture here. So exactly, you can plant on either side right up to the border. So you draw an imaginary line down from the area that's roofed in, and immediately on either side you can plant two different things.
In the previous case, when we were talking about the roof, remember we were saying maybe you have to start from 4 arms away. But according to this, you can build. Well,
because this is a proper wall for both sides. In the case of the small chutzner to the big chutzner, we said you look at it like a wall for the big chutzner, but for the small chutzner, it's not a wall. So to me, it looks like on one side you have vines. These look like vines. These look like big Brussels sprouts, which I don't know if you're ever allowed to plant. Okay, so Zok to Gemara. So the halacha is mutal izroya gefan kan mutal izroya kan. The ila hishvei is kiryoi aser. But if you extended the roof, Shakira kol habayis, if you extended the roof to cover over the whole area, aser elam ken yerchet. So you see that that a mechitza makes an isser, because by adding the ceiling, you're actually making a problem. Amalei again, Hasam siluk mechitzasu. Because when you're adding to the roof, you're actually moving the imaginary wall of Pitikra. So
Isn't that removing the mechitza?
Hashlamazu silak Pitikra vein kamato. By adding to the roof, you're not just adding, you're actually relocating the location of the Pitikra wall. So again, you cannot find me any examples of cases where adding a barrier makes it more chomer. Sholach li Rav Abaye biyad Rav Shmaya bar Zira. So Rava sent a message to Abaye with Rav Shmaya. So Rashi says, "Tzivo lahashav l'Abaye tshuvazu." Rava told Rav Shmaya, "Do me a favor. I want you to tell this to Abaye." V'loy matzinu mechitza le'iser. Again, are you claiming that you never find a place where adding a mechitza makes it more usher? But Tanya, we learned, yesh b'mechitzas hakerem lahakel ulahachmer. When it comes to mechitzas and a kerem, sometimes the mechitza will make a kula, and sometimes the mechitza will make a chomer. Zok Rashi lahakel ulahachmer. Va'amim shamechitza materes le'inyan klayim. Sometimes the mechitza helps for klayim and it acts as a barrier where you can plant on either side. Upamim shiyoseres, and sometimes building a wall actually creates an iser. Ketan. Let's see how this works out in practical application. Hanatua ad iker mechitza zoireya meikar mechitza be'elech. Let's see what Rashi says. Hanatua ad iker mechitza. Like Rashi kloimer al yisoid mechitza samak v'davik l'mechitza. If you plant right up on the border wall, hanatua ad iker mechitza zoireya meikar mechitza be'elech. On the other side, you're allowed to plant other things. If you notice, Natua and Zereya are two different things. So if you had Natiais on the one side of the Mechitza up until and touching the Mechitza, then on the other side of the Mechitza, you're allowed to plant other items. She'ilu ain't show Mechitza. If there was no Mechitza there at all, Marchik Dalet Amis v'Zereya, you would have to leave a gap of 4 amis between the two different species that you're planting. V'zehu Mechitza Kerem Lahakel. This is an example of the fact that there was a wall there allows us to plant two different species literally right up against each other because there's a wall in between. Ula Hachmer, what's an example of a wall causing a problem? Ketet, Yud Aleph Amma. What if you planted something that was 11 amas away from the koisel? And we're going to see the significance of Yud Aleph Amma. It has to do with the service corridor that you need to service these plants, but we'll see Rashi. You're not allowed to bring another plant in between there. If there was no mechitza 11 amas away, all you would have to do is leave a gap of 4 amas, and then you could plant something else there. But now that there's a wall 11 amas away, that entire 11 amas has to be left fallow. Let's see Rashi for an explanation. If you had a row of vines that was 11 amas away from the wall, you're not allowed to plant anything between the kerem and the fence. The time of Mefarish Lakamon, the Gemara is going to explain why. But I'll call upon them, you see that if there's a fence there, then you have to leave up to 11 amas clear. And if there was no fence there, 4 amas would be enough. So this is a perfect example of a wall actually creates a problem, doesn't make a solution. Omar Lay. So I guess Abaye answered back to Rav Shmaya to pass the message back to Rava. According to you, you can ask me a kasha from the Mishnah. Why are you? Rashi says, why would you ask me this kasha? Why would you prove your point that sometimes a mechitza could be l'chumra from a brisa? There's a Mishnah that you could have proven your point from. It's none we learned. Karachas hakerem. L'kamim mafash. The Gemara is going to explain what it means, but I assume it means if there's a blank space. Karachas is a bald spot. There's a blank space in the middle of the kerem. Beis Shammai oimim chof dalar amos. V'sil oimim tesai namo. What does that mean, Dr. Rashi? Eshevar b'amos. Sorich sheheba. In order, if you have a bald spot, a blank spot in the middle of a kerem where nothing is planted, you'd have to have 24 amas space in between the two closest vines, la tira, in order to allow you to plant something else in the middle. Laharchik arba amos v'lizroya. If you wanted to be able to plant another species in a vineyard, you'd have to have at least a gap of 24 amos in between the two vines, and then you'd have to be 4 amos away from the closest vine. V'impachus, but if the bald spot is, or the fallow spot in this vineyard is less than 24 amos, oshel izroyaba afilu tefach. You're not allowed to make, and you're not allowed to plant anything else in there. Mechoil hakerem, sovev kein mechoilos. So that means the area around the whole kerem. So it's not a place that's in between two plants. It's rather between the plant and the wall. You have to leave 16 amos between the plant and the wall. You only have to leave 12 amos. Now the Gemara explains, or the Bryce explains, or the Mishnah explains what these things are. The Eza he karachas kerem. What exactly is a karachas kerem? Zok the Heilige Mishnah. Kerem shecharav emtziusai. In the middle of the kerem, some plants died, so there's like a fallow spot smack in the middle. Im ein shom tesai nama. If there are no 60 namas, if there's not a blank of 60 namas, lo yavi zer l'sham. You're not allowed to plant anything else there. And here Rashi helps us. Ein shom sheis esrayam. Lefishayesh kerem mikan umikan. Right, when you have a bald spot, a fallow spot in the middle of a kerem, that means you have rows on either side of this fallow spot. First, right off the bat, there has to be 4 amos of empty fallow space, because the rig that's used to service the kerem is a moli bucker and it's kelev, and that's 4 amos. So you charshim b'shvarim. So right away, out of the 16 amos, you lost 8. 4 on the side by one row, and 4 on the side by the other row, and now you're left with 8. If you have 8 amos in the middle, then if you split 8 divided by 2, you'll have 4 amos on either side. Therefore, an 8 amos section of land is considered a significant enough piece of land that we don't say it's bottle to the area that it's in. And therefore, so the problem here is, if the land that's in the fallow area is not significant, then you automatically treat it like a kerem. It's like bottle to its surroundings. And if it's bottle to its surroundings, you're surely not allowed to plant some other species in an area that has a status of a kerem. But if there's 16 amos there, then even if you delete the 4 amos of the service corridor from either side, you're still left with 8 amos in the middle. 8 amos in the middle is significant enough of a space that we say it has its independence, and it's not going to be considered a kerem, and therefore you're allowed to plant in there. I guess we should stop here.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go back a little bit tomorrow to Chazer, but at least we got a head start. Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach. Have a wonderful.